I'm afraid I didn't get your first and third question, so I'll just mention your second. Yes, discontinuity can be problematic, especially if you do achieve infinite achievements in one dimension. Thank goodness we don't see infinite achievements, and hopefully that won't occur. But you're right, even small achievements in one direction cannot be compensated by large achievements in the other. But then my whole discussion is in terms of large and small differences. That requires cardinal discussion. If you have cardinal variables, we can augment our approach. If you don't have cardinal variables, then the whole discussion of what it means to be large versus small goes away. So, to the extent that we have better data, it can be accommodated to some extent. To the extent that you don't have better data, we're stuck with what we have. But I agree with you that there is a multiplicity of discontinuities. Hopefully, again, you have that whole discussion of wave hands rapidly and hope that everyone understands that they will be smoothed out across dimensions and so on. Probably not, but we can at least study what types of problems we can expect. Okay. I didn't hear your first. I'll talk to you about the first and third afterwards then. As far as how do we avoid trade-offs, now, we don't avoid trade-offs. We don't make them. I mean, we simply don't allow the possibility of one dimension to compensate for deprivations in another dimension. And so immediately you see that there's not a trade-off possible, that I cannot have enough education to compensate in a fundamental sense, in our multidimensional sense, for malnutrition. It won't happen. Malnutrition will still be there in the underlying data. They won't be washed out as I would have washed out had I combined all the achievements into one index, called it Well-Being Index 1, okay? In which case, high in one could wash out the low in the other, so you, oh, nice. Isn't that everything's nice and even? Our approach won't allow that, and we intentionally don't allow that because we think the deprivations are, each of them, very important as a kind of strong complementarity behind our thought. But then once having identified dimensions of deprivation, yes, we are substitutable across in terms of measurement. Okay, so how do we do it? That's how we do it, I suppose. And I'll talk to you a little bit later if that doesn't succeed. Okay.
So this is the last round. So everybody who wants to speak. Start with Rinku.
Thanks. Just first, before I ask my question, I mean, James, you had asked a question about did we think it had desired, does this approach have desired properties? And speaking from an India perspective and thinking about it from the point of view of designing a proxy means test, I think it has extremely desirable properties, and maybe we can discuss that at length later. But I just wanted to come back to a question that's been raised by several, that if you could start from scratch, if you were not data constrained, what would you do? And in that, what I'm thinking of, again, from an India perspective where the government is designing a proxy means test, in terms of the choice of indicators and weights, there's no getting around the normative judgments. And those will be made, but for legitimacy, there is also a concern on the part of the government to also go through a technical and scientific exercise. So if you had to do a scientific exercise and you had the option of designing a survey that you would field all over the country, what would you do? And what is my sense is that it's a little bit more of an art than a science, but to the extent that there is some systematic approach that you would suggest in selecting indicators and choosing weights, what would that be? Thanks.
Samuel, then Juan.
Yes. Thank you very much, Samuel Freire from the Latin American Poverty Unit. One question I would like to ask to whoever wants to answer is, since you show that it's not perfectly correlated, but the monetary poverty approach shows a very similar ranking. And if the ranking is one of the purposes of this, shouldn't we be choosing dimensions in terms of the orthogonality of them? Because otherwise we don't win them a lot. So we should include dimensions that are almost orthogonal to monetary variables because they are not orthogonal or are highly correlated. In terms of ranking, we gain very little. I wonder whether this should be one of the indicators of the kind of dimensions we should be using. Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Tondo from the research department. So my question supposes that the multidimensional poverty index is used for policy decisions. And so when we have a panel of health education, there is an implicit marginal rate of substitution between those two dimensions, which is country-specific and time-specific. Now with the use of a system of weights, normative weights, which have the property of being fixed over time and comparable over countries, don't we run the risk of having a misallocation of resources because of this tension between what is useful now and comparability over time and space? Thanks.
Who was next then? Louis.
Louise, too. First, let me just say that it's a real pleasure to see James and Sabine and their team here and John here today with us. I think it's great that you came to the bank to present this approach. And this is a great discussion to be having, and thanks to Jaime and Pete for orchestrating it. Just a quick question. It was really interesting to see the robustness tests that we had talked about earlier, which were looking at the impact of the various dimensions or how many dimensions you included. But you looked at them across country ranking, which makes sense given your objective as a UNDP report where you're really interested in country ranking, and that really matters. But I think for us, where a lot of the rubber might hit the fan with the MPI is at the country level and using it for, I don't think that was the right expression, but anyway, it was good enough. It was
We got it. The alternative wasn't that good.
Oh, well. Anyway, you got to have a little humor in a discussion. It's good. For us, it's at the policy level, and when you... Thanks, John. When you want to use it in terms of targeting, I think. And for that, it would be interesting to see how this indicate, what some robustness tests at the country level. And I think you've made the point very strongly that this needs to be adapted to country circumstances. And so I think it's also important to be cautionary about taking the index such as it's constructed at a global level and saying you're going to apply it for policy purposes, particularly targeting at a country level. And I think maybe Gonzalo will get to that in his presentation, but I just did want to put the issue out there. Thank you.
I guess, well, my primary question was about the weights, but I understand you'll talk about that more in the afternoon. But just a quick point of clarification, you must have used probability weights, though, right, to get out national estimates from these in addition to the normative weights. I assume that must be the case, and just asking for a clarification on that. And I think my other question is, did you think much in terms of what it means to be defining one of the dimensions of deprivation along lines that some people might not have defined? So a newly married family or a young family might not have had children, and so they won't have children under they won't have malnourished children or won't have had infant mortality. And how does that think about adding up across dimensions where there are really sort of undefined elements? Now, do you view those as missing values and therefore get dropped from the analysis? And so how do you think about the difference between missing values, or what you're calling missing values, and undefined values? And how does that think about the dimensions of it? And then how does that affect the comparability if some are defined across more dimensions than others, is the key question there. And then just a semantic question in terms, or maybe comment, in terms of presentation, I guess I would suggest it probably makes sense not to even introduce the term poor when you're talking about deprivation along certain dimensions, because poor is not something that you define until you're looking across dimensions, and I think that is a little confusing in some of the slides.
I'm Nobuo Yoshida from Prem PR. My question is very similar to Rinku's question. So at the end of the day, if we want to give some advice to the government, we need to give them, what is a better measure of MPI. So, for example, in terms of weight, maybe if we can calculate marginal rate of substitution, we can give government officials, basically implication of weights. Sometimes we differ from equal weights, but by calculating this, we can give them some information. So this kind of like some kind of suggestion, what kind of multidimensional indicator is good. For example, in terms of data set, it is clear now, like Indonesia's data set, if we have wide variety of variables, that's always better because we can have more freedom to choose dimensions. So that's, I understand. But my question is, suppose if we are politicians, what kind of information we need to have to decide, a good multidimensional indicator? For example, I'm poverty economist and I'm very familiar with Bangladesh poverty situation. But if somebody asks me, okay, what kind of weight we should allocate to nutrition? But this is an important question because, at the end of the day, just allocating number to poverty itself is not important. At the end of the day, what is a ratio between weight for nutrition and weight for poverty is an important key indicator. And to decide that, we need to know both. And if we have 10 indicators, you need to know all indicators' relative importance. Relative importance is critical rather than a particular number for one indicator. So this means if we want to say something about weight, you need to know everything, and that's almost impossible. So maybe we can do some stated preference survey, ask everybody, okay, what do you think? And then collect some information, that's one thing, and then do other more statistical exercise to get some indication from data. But I just want to know if we become advisor for government, what kind of information we need to have and what kind of analysis we need to have in advance.
So now we can turn, I think, to Jaime and Peter. Let me see if I get to ask anything. But anyway.
Yeah.
Answer a few of them while you're there, please.
So I also am very grateful to James and Sabina and Mariama for coming to talk to us today. It's been really a very interesting discussion so far, and I'm looking forward to the continuation for the rest of the day. And I thought I'd just throw in a question that just came to my mind as we were listening to the presentations and also the questions. I mean, James opened up and made the remark, which I think is true, about one of the things that's changed in the world over the last 10, 20 years has been just this huge explosion of data and information that's available, and I think that's true. And certainly in the Poverty and Inequality Group, we've been dealing with a lot of this data, the new data, and one of the things that we've been learning is just how difficult it is to get at what we're often trying to get at. And I know on the income and consumption side, which is more or less my area of specialization, we're continuously learning, and we're still doing a whole lot of work and experimentation at the moment on how to get those data better and how to make more sense of those data. Should we be using recall periods, or should we be doing diary methods and all kinds of things? And we really are learning a lot about how the kind of information we're getting varies depending on those types of experiments and so on. And I know from other colleagues in my group who are working much more in the area of health and education that very similar issues are in those domains. And then, of course, there's all these other dimensions that are even a little bit more elusive still to us, such as empowerment or feelings of social connectedness and so on. There's a whole lot of work that's going on there. So we have, on the one hand, a huge explosion or expansion of information, and then also increasingly awareness of how far the goalposts are still, and we're still running to try to get to the goalposts within any of these dimensions. And then the thing that concerns me, or that I'm struck by here in this multidimensional poverty index approach, is that we really are constrained by the methodology to be working with a survey that has all the dimensions for every individual, every household. And so I'm asking myself, strategically, where should we be putting our energies? What should we be putting our effort into? Should it be getting a better understanding of any of these dimensions, but possibly involving very specialized surveys that are specialized in and tailored to those particular dimensions that they're trying to understand better? Or should we be really putting our effort into trying to find surveys and having all these indicators in the same survey when we're increasingly aware that might actually compromise to a real considerable extent the quality of information